Good day, everyone. Welcome to another installment of our midweek Bible studies. This has been a walk through the New Testament. We've covered all of the New Testament books up until the final one. This is the last week, or at least the last book of the New Testament that we need to cover. I don't know what we'll be doing after this. I haven't really thought that far ahead. We do have another sermon series planned, focused um, on Christmas and what does God mean for us in 2020? What does God mean for us during the Christmas season? And so I don't know what will happen with this time. Enough people have said that they appreciate this, that I don't have any intention of stopping. But we'll have to think about what we do from here on out, because yeah, this week we'll be talking about Revelation, and Revelation is the final book in the New Testament. One thing about this installment of this Bible study, if I were to cover Revelation in any sort of detail, um, I could probably go on for an entire year, speaking every single week on just this book, and yeah, you probably would not exhaust subjects to cover. What the book actually says, how we apply it to our time, what it teaches us about God and the world and history. And so this is not going to be in any way, shape, or form an exhaustive treatment of this book. There are, entire Bible commentary series written about this. This will just be a very general overview of this book. I'm going to hit some important points, go over some of the ways that people interpret this book, and give you a bit of a case study on just what those interpretive methods look like. But I'd encourage you to do your own study into this book. It's a fascinating work that has really captivated the imaginations of many Christians over the years. All right, so that's just a disclaimer here. Don't expect any kind of really deep dive into this. This is sort of just to whet your appetite for this book, and as it just kind of remind us, what the grand themes of this are, and what sort of way our interpretations should maybe go, and what we should keep in mind as we're reading this book. So let's get into this, the final work of the New Testament. First of all, Revelation can be very confusing to read, just because it switches styles so often. Okay, it's at least, it's several different styles of writing that are all kind of mashed together. And sometimes those transitions between styles can be a bit jarring and make it very difficult to just kind of read this book straight through. There are a lot of changes in scene. There's a lot of changes in tone. You can be talking about worshiping God in this magnificent throne room, and then suddenly like these colored horses come out of nowhere, and you've got all this other strange stuff happening. And so, yeah, how should we read this book, and what should we keep in mind? Revelation is at least three distinct classes of writing, all sort of mashed together. First of all, Revelation shows signs of being a letter. There are many letters in the New Testament, lots of examples that we can look at, from personal letter like Philemon, to letters written to churches and communities like many of the letters of Paul. And then you have general letters, like the book of James, or the Johannine letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, that are not written to a person or even a specific community, but just written to a class of people. In this case, Christians scattered all over the Roman Empire, and just written to those kinds of people in general. Revelation, it does begin like a letter, and it ends like a letter. You have this sort of address. We learn to whom it's written, In chapter 1, it is written to 7 churches in the province of Asia Minor, and I've mentioned this a number of times in our study, but Asia Minor does not refer to Thailand, Malaysia, China, Korea, Japan, but rather what we now call the country of Turkey. And so in this province, a Roman province that now occupies what we call Turkey, there are 7 churches there in 7 cities, and this is to whom the letter is addressed. At the very end of Revelation, it ends with a kind of a direction to the people who are reading it, as well as a really nice benediction, sort of wishing a blessing on those who are reading it. And so it does look a lot like a letter. In chapters 2 and 3, the writer does address specifically these 7 churches in these 7 cities, and talks about some local concerns that are happening. And so Revelation definitely does look like a letter, specifically what we call a circular letter, where it would start off in one place, and then those people would then pass it on to the next group of people via courier, or if one person was going from one city to another, they would just pass it on. And if you look on a map with these cities, you will see that these cities are all in kind of a ring. Okay, it's this circular pattern in Asia Minor, starting in Ephesus and ending in Laodicea. So Revelation does look a lot like a letter, and we can read it like that. But it's not just a letter. Revelation also reads like a prophecy, and it's referred to as a prophecy several times in the book itself. Okay, blessed is the one who hears and reads the words of this prophecy. So Revelation, it does share a lot in common with other prophetic works, specifically the Old Testament prophets. And you can see 3 prophetic works where Revelation really does take its cues from, and it borrows a lot of the style that is in those. Specifically, the book of Ezekiel, at the very end of Ezekiel, chapter 48, and I think, building up to 48, several of those last chapters in Ezekiel, there's this fantastic description of the temple, a rebuilt temple, and Jerusalem restored to its former glory. And of course, then at the end of Revelation, we see the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven back down to this recreated earth. And so that seems to be taken from Ezekiel and really expanded. If you look at the dimensions of the city in Ezekiel and then look at the dimensions of the city in Revelation, people have measured this out, and the New Jerusalem would take up like most of the western United States if that was transplanted into our time and our world. Okay? And so, yeah, this fanciful description of, this restored city and the spectacular dimensions and the spectacular description of it are taken kind of from the book of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel also, from Ezekiel 1, you have this description of a mobile throne of God, and in Revelation we're taken up, to the throne in heaven, and we see all these fantastic heavenly creatures and such. So those are some of the things from the book of Ezekiel. Daniel, of course, you have these beasts that rise up, and these beasts represent kind of worldly powers that are in an opposition to God, but ultimately exist by his will, sort of, and he allows them to rise up and to reign for some time. And this is a really important thing in Daniel, where we see this progression of beasts that are representing earthly powers. And then, of course, in Revelation, you have this progression of beasts similarly, especially in Revelation 13, that also represent these powers on earth that are opposed to God and are oppressing God's people. And then in Zechariah, Zechariah has a description of colored horses, and Revelation then takes up that theme from Zechariah with these horsemen riding these colored horses, and other, these fantastic scenes that are representative of things in the spiritual realm as well as things that are happening on Earth. So, yeah, the author of Revelation was clearly very well versed in Old Testament writings, knew about prophetic works. So yeah, we see a lot of where Revelation takes its material from. It's clearly meant to be kind of a throwback to these familiar Old Testament prophets. Also, in prophecies and prophetic writings, this is not just a call to sort of understand what God is wanting or what God is doing in the world. There's also this element of you need to hear, you need to understand, and you also need to obey it. Okay, this should change the way that you're living your life. It's not just a matter of, okay, this is what God is doing. It's, okay, this is what God wants you to do as well. And so Revelation makes some very bold claims on its readers and kind of forces its readers to, make choices about what they are doing, who they are serving, and what are you going to do going forward. Okay, now that you know this information, that you've heard the words of God, what are you going to do with that? And so that's a very important element of Old Testament prophecy, and Revelation does the same thing. So this is definitely a prophetic work that is meant to be read in conjunction with the Old Testament prophets. Finally, Revelation is an apocalypse, and an apocalypse is it was actually kind of a very popular category of writings and literature that became prominent a few hundred years before Jesus, kind of in that intertestamental time after the last of the Old Testament prophets were active, and then through this time before the New Testament. Very important for certainly with Jews, because if you look at history, there were a lot of really important things and some very tumultuous times for the Jewish nation in between the Testaments. You had, the fall of Jerusalem in the early 500 BC, and then just this shifting of powers. Basically, the area around Israel got passed down from Babylon to Persia. Then Greece came up and took control. The Greek Empire just shattered into at least four separate entities, and then the Romans came. And so through all of these upheavals, the Jewish people became very familiar with and began producing these works called apocalypse. And some things about apocalyptic writing. The first thing that you have to know, and really I kind of put it at the end here, but first thing that you have to know is that apocalypse is very much black and white. There is this black and white morality. You have to choose between serving God and serving with the devil, almost these demonic forces. And you'll have these scenes of these enormous spiritual armies, armies of angels and armies of demons. In some of these apocalyptic works, they would get very much into details, detailing like what kind of armor they were wearing, what their battle standards looked like, the horses that they were riding. Get really into like describing the armies of God and the armies of Satan, and describing how these battles played out, how many people were dying, what was going on. And you must make a choice. There is no in-between in these apocalyptic writings. You are either on God's side or you are on the side of the demons and the devil. Okay? And, at some point, everyone is going to have to choose. That's a really basic thing that is kind of common to all of these apocalyptic writings. And Revelation is very much like this. Okay? You have God and the Lamb and what they are doing. And then you have on the other side, you have this Satan portrayed as either a serpent or a great red dragon. And then with the dragon stands these beasts, a false prophet, all these things. And really at the end of the book, there is no one who is in the middle of this. There's nobody who is undecided. Everybody has to choose a side. Okay, and if you're sitting there on the fence, kind of waffling about what side to choose, you're probably going to fall off of that fence, and you're probably going to fall off on the wrong side. And so Revelation is always challenging. What side are you on? Who are you worshiping? Who do you serve? And this is a really important question throughout the entire book. Other things about apocalyptic writings, these are really challenging to read. Really vivid images. Okay, that's something about this. If you made this into a movie or something, it would be very easy to just splash a whole bunch of really spectacular visual effects on there. But trying to find any kind of narrative or story would be a bit more challenging. Apocalyptic writings, they have these really striking images of things like weird heavenly creatures. The descriptions of angels, are sometimes pretty terrifying. These are beings that are burning like fire. They're covered with eyes. They're covered with wings. And you see this in Revelation 4 and 5, describing this throne room. And you have these creatures. One has a face like a man. One looks like a lion, one looks like a bear, and all these things. Okay, these bizarre, like, heavenly creatures. You have descriptions of angels, descriptions of demonic powers, locusts flying out of a bottomless pit, and they have stingers. They sting people. Angels kind of dive bombing the earth with bowls filled with like the fiery wrath of God. Yeah, spiritual warfare, the end of the world, all of these things, and all portrayed in this very, like, striking images that just grab your attention and don't let go. I've read in several commentaries that over the years, Revelation has consistently been one of the most popular works with people who are relatively uneducated. And probably one of the reasons is because, you don't have to have a whole lot of education. You don't have to, know a lot about language and words and ideas to really appreciate what's happening in Revelation, because it's just all of this very visual type imagery, and it will just grab your attention. Okay? And so, it's not like sifting through some of Paul's arguments in Romans 5 through 8. It's not, going through Hebrews and trying to remember your history of your Old Testament characters. It's just, hey, there's a big red dragon, and he's sitting on the earth, and his tail sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky, and he belches out this water and is trying to kill this woman and her child. Okay, yeah, doesn't take a lot of interpretive gifts or Bible education to understand what's going on there. So that's something about Revelation. Okay, as we're reading this, keep this in mind. Okay, it follows these three patterns, and this will give us kind of a framework to understand how the letter is, or this book is constructed. It is a letter. It's written to certain people at a certain time. It is intended to be a prophecy in the vein of the Old Testament prophets. It does make some claims on morality and questions of right and wrong and how you're to live your life. And then it's portrayed in the form of this apocalyptic writing, where you better make a choice, you better know whose side you're on, and if you're not on the right side, you're going to get caught up in some really serious stuff that includes spiritual warfare and the end of the world. Okay, so that's something about how this book is put together. Now let's talk about some of the historical details, at least what we think we know about when this book was written and the people that it was written to. something about the authorship of Revelation, some interesting stuff going on here. Uh, Most of the New Testament works that are not the letters of Paul are anonymous. We do not know who wrote, for example, any of the Gospels. We don't know exactly who wrote Acts. We think it's the same person who wrote Luke, okay, but yeah, we don't know who wrote Luke, so we don't know who wrote Acts. We also don't know for sure who wrote things like Hebrews. Okay, so a lot of the New Testament is anonymous. We do have a lot of letters that were written by Paul. But here, Revelation, the author comes out and identifies himself right away. In chapter 1, verse 4, it says, he pops out and says, John, okay, to his audience. And then he also, in verse 9, he says, gives a little bit more about himself. And he says, I, John, was on Patmos because of Jesus. So who is this John? There are possible Johns. Of course, we have a John who was the apostle of Jesus, the person that we think likely provided the eyewitness basis for the Gospel of John, at least one of the candidates for that eyewitness testimony. Then, along with that, we have John the Elder. We don't know for sure who this person was, but we think that it may have had a hand in writing 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. If you go back to that study, I mentioned that we think that there was a separate John the Elder who may have written that. He may have been a disciple of the apostle John. And then you have this person, John the Revelator, John the Seer. And these three Johns could all be the same person. Okay, there are some people who believe that John the Apostle of Jesus wrote the Gospel of John, also wrote the letters of John, and is this John who wrote Revelation. This view was challenged very early on in Christian history. There are a number of early church fathers and leaders who did not believe these people were the same person. Right, and there may have been 3 separate people. John the Elder may have been the same as John the Revelator, but we're not sure. Okay? What we do know is that, yeah, this person does write in a very similar style to the Gospel of John as well as the letters, which is one reason why the Gospel has been named John, and those 3 letters are 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, even though we don't have an author identifying him or herself in those writings. All right. But yeah, Revelation, it's written in a somewhat similar style to those other works. But we do think that the current guess of kind of academic people who study this thing is that these were probably separate people, but who were kind of involved in the same community, in the same tradition. Whoever this was, this John was, this person was very familiar with the Old Testament. As I mentioned before, there's a very strong connection between the Old Testament prophets and this book, and also very familiar with the apocalyptic style that had become popular in the centuries before this work was written. A very good writer, a very, has a lot of flourishes and kind of blends these different aspects of letter, prophecy, apocalyptic, makes them into this kind of seamless work, and is obviously very familiar with these kinds of writings. Because of the familiarity with the Old Testament, we believe that this John was likely a Jewish Christian, had a very good command of the Jewish scriptures and Jewish thinking. Probably somebody who moved to the province of Asia Minor. We're guessing maybe after the Roman persecution of AD 70, when the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. And so at that time, any Jewish people who were in that area would have been scattered. And so possibly this was a Christian who had a Jewish background and fled from maybe Jerusalem or at at least Palestine and moved up to the province of Asia Minor. This was a person who was well acquainted with the churches in this area, probably became a leader of these churches, some kind of caretaker, either a pastor or a deacon or somebody, okay, that was prominent among them, and mentions that he is on Patmos because of Jesus, for the sake of Jesus. And so we think probably exiled to Patmos by the local authorities. And this is a tradition that John was persecuted by the Roman authorities and exiled to Patmos. And there are some stories about him. They tried to execute him. Stories about him being boiled alive in oil, and they couldn't kill him. And so they finally gave up and just said, okay, we're just going to stash you away on this island. And Patmos is fairly close to the coast of Asia Minor. I've actually been there. I've been to Patmos, and there's this little monastery that's built kind of above this cave, and you can go inside the cave, and this cave is supposedly where John the Revelator had the vision of Revelation. And so that's kind of a cool thing to do, and you walk through this squeeze into this tiny little cave, and then you look up on the hill, and there's this big old monastery up there. So, but yeah, Patmos, it's a small little island, but fairly close to the coast. And so, yeah, John was probably sent there because of his activities with these churches. Something about the historical background, what we know about, the time that this was written, and there's some dispute about when exactly this letter was written, but the early church, very soon after the New Testament was kind of codified, people were starting to say that Revelation was written during the reign of Emperor Domitian, and you can see the dates of his reign there, 84 to 96 AD. Probably towards the end of that. We think it was probably written in the 90s, so maybe early to mid-90s is the likely date of this writing. Why do we think that it was written during this time? Well, one thing is that Domitian, one of the things that he did was he proclaimed himself to be a god. He was not satisfied with just being the emperor of Rome. He actually said that, yeah, he was a god, a son of the gods, and he demanded worship of himself. While you might think that the emperor, whatever the emperor says goes, there were a number of people kind of close to that imperial palace level, some of the advisors, some historians that did not view this claim very well. They did not think that it was appropriate for an emperor to do this. And so the reign of Domitian very much gets mixed reviews among Roman historians. Okay, there are some people who say he did a good job, but then others are like, yeah, but then he also did this thing that he really shouldn't have done. Even though you're the emperor, you're just a man, and you're claiming to be divine, and you're demanding worship, and that's not what you should be doing. Okay, and so Revelation, there's enough in there that seems to be really a broadside against the claims of the Roman Empire, and saying you can't worship anything but God, and especially when these worldly powers demand worship, remember who you're really supposed to be worshiping. And so Revelation kind of takes up that resistance theme in it, and so we think, hey, lots of stuff about worship, lots of stuff about proper worship, and so it may have come during this time where this guy was saying, I'm God and you should worship me. One difficulty of dating it to Domitian's reign is that there's lots of words about persecution in Revelation. It certainly seems to be that the worldly powers, are just trampling down on Christians and God's people, and we should really feel bad for them, but also, there's this call to be patient and persevere. Problem is that there's no record of this violent empire-wide persecution of Christians. This does not seem to be a policy of the empire during this time. That's led some people to say, oh, you know what, Revelation might have been written earlier during the reign of Nero, and you can see Nero's dates there, 54 to 68, where there definitely was violent persecution of Christians, and we actually think that Paul and Peter were martyred during Nero's reign. And so because of that, people say, well, there's lots of persecution in Revelation, and lots of depictions of Christians being, put to death for their faith. And so this probably was during the reign of Nero. Well, there are some problems with that too. Okay, and so some ideas are that Domitian is being used as like a second Nero, or Revelation is saying, yeah, this current guy that we have, he's making these claims to godhood. He might not be persecuting, killing you, but just be careful because he's putting the foundations out there, and just you wait because he's going to become like this. There was a popular conspiracy theory during this time that said that Nero was either not actually dead or that he had died, but he'd be resurrected and he'd return. And some of them, the more fanciful descriptions of this, said that he would be leading this like horde of foreign invaders, and he would completely obliterate the empire, kind of in revenge. And so, this was out there, and this can be seen in Revelation, possibly this description of the beast. One of the beasts had a mortal wound, and it was healed, and then everybody was marveled at this, and they followed this beast. And this might be an allusion to Nero and this kind of conspiracy theory that was out there. So most sources do indeed date Revelation to the decade of the 90s, 90 to 100, kind of in the early to middle part of that era. Okay. Now, this is written as a letter, and some things about Asia Minor, because this is written to 7 churches in Asia. I've listed the cities that it's written to there: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And again, these were actual cities, and they're kind of in a circle. You can travel a road that goes to all of these cities. Something about Asia Minor and this area. Asia, so it's Turkey, and so Turkey is fairly far away from Rome, right? You have Rome on the Italian peninsula there, and in between you have Greece, and then you have the Aegean Sea that separates Greece from Turkey. And so Asia was pretty far away from Rome, but they were also very dependent on it. Not the most economically developed area, certainly not as much as Greece. So they were very dependent on Rome to kind of improve their cities and improve, just their quality of life. And so people were very devoted to the empire and very, patriotic. Lots of people saying, that, hey, Rome gave us a lot of good stuff and we need to keep their favor. There's this term here that I put on the slide, Neokaros. The Neokaros is not referring to a person, but rather it's talking about a city. And it was a city that had the privilege of being kind of the center for the imperial cult. The emperor worship for the province, and this would be the central city for all of those services. The city could run kind of athletic games in honor of the emperor. They would they would be making images to the emperor, all of these things. And of course, whoever got this title, whichever city became the Neokaros, also got a lot of favor. You have lots of Roman money flowing in there while people were making idols and while people were making all this good stuff happen. And so there was a lot of competition between cities for this title, and particularly the cities of Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum. Particularly, there was a real rivalry between Ephesus and Pergamum, okay, for this title. And so, yeah, a lot of patriotic fervor. Whenever this title would be up for grabs, then these cities were vying for the attention of the emperor and the Roman government in general. And so, yeah, I'm sure during this time you'd have all these patriotic demonstrations and saying, here's why our city is so much better than that other city. Okay, here's why we love the emperor so much more. Uh, as you can imagine, this would have been a problem for certainly for Jews, also for Christians, because you're not supposed to worship people like the emperor, and therefore, and if you were there, especially during one of these times when all of these patriotic things were happening, that would have been really tough. A lot of pressure to go ahead and show what a good citizen you were, how much you loved the emperor and were going to worship him. And the Jews and the Christians would have been kind of out in the cold, saying we can only worship God. Another element of life in this area were called trade guilds, and these were kind of gatherings of people in similar businesses, and they would get together and they would help each other out. But then this also became a thing where in order to set up a business or to have any kind of success, you had to go through the trade guild. And then along with that came, hey, you want to become a part of the trade guild, you need to help promote our city, which would then go towards this emperor worship thing. Okay, and so, yeah, a lot of social, economic, and religious pressure that Christians would have been facing. And when you read the letters in Revelation 2 and 3, you can really get a sense that there is a lot of tension happening. Even in places that do not have overt persecution, there's a lot of pull. What are you going to do? Are you going to worship the idols? Are you going to compromise with the world? Or are you going to stay faithful to God? And so there were these very diverse experiences for these churches. These churches were all packed pretty close together. I think there was about 150 miles that separate the farthest churches, and these 7 cities would have all been packed into this area. So a pretty small geographic area, but when you read these letters, you can see that these churches were all experiencing very diverse things. There is evidence, for example, of localized persecution. The letters to Smyrna and Philadelphia reference difficulties that are happening in these cities. But some churches, on the other hand, were really not being persecuted. The Church of Sardis seems to be have it very easy. Laodicea, they come out and say, like, hey, we're rich, we're doing okay, we don't need any help. And so, yeah, you have this real diversity of experience, and John is trying to write to all of these different churches. In some churches, there's not a threat kind of from the outside, worldly persecution and pressure, but instead you have this internal struggle where different people are struggling for power and looking for to be the leaders, and are actually opposing John who's writing these letters. And in Pergamum, in Ephesus, in Thyatira, you have these other elements in the church themselves that are opposing John, and John speaks really strongly against them and says these people are not teaching the right thing. So these churches all had different experiences, they all had different concerns, but one message of Revelation, the consistent message to all of these churches, is that nothing that you see is true. What you think is happening is not actually happening, and we're going to kind of pull the veil out and show you what is actually going on. Now, I am very aware that this is already coming up on 40 minutes, I think. and I have a lot more to present, and so I'm going to end this first part of the video now and invite you to tune in to our worship service on Saturdays at 11:10. This week, December 5, I will be speaking on Revelation. And you can, so yeah, if you're interested, you can tune into our worship service here on this channel, and yeah, I'll be speaking on this a little bit more. But yeah, we'll bring an end to this first part, and the second part then we'll move on from the historical consideration to then kind of the themes of Revelation and ways that we can interpret this book. All right, so thanks for being here, and yeah, join us for the second part of this study of Revelation.